Good afternoon, everyone, or morning or evening, depending upon where you are. Today, we're going to be talking about strategic mindset, having a strategic mindset. It's one of the topics that I come across quite often when we're talking with different organizations, talking about what skills they want IT people to have, and they typically talk about the soft skills. And one of them that I've noticed is having a strategic mindset. In other words, thinking forward towards the future so that the decisions you make today will set you up for the best possible place to be in the future. And we've seen this with the COVID-19, that strategic planning could help make organizations better able to respond during something like a pandemic. I am joined today by Robert DeRoeck and Ron Puccinelli. Robert is at Indiana University. Ron is at City of Fairfield. Do you guys want to give a brief introduction?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert DeRoeck. I'm a technical trainer at Indiana University. I work with 1,800 IT pros on 9 campuses, covering ranging in technologies from entry-level help desk all the way up to advanced deployments using System-Centered Configuration Manager, Intune, and cloud support through Azure and AWS.
Greetings. My name is Ron Puccinelli. I am the Chief Information Officer for the City of Fairfield in San Francisco Bay Area in California. I cover all of the technology for the city, including public safety, police, fire, emergency medical, radios, etc. And also have responsibility for the cybersecurity side of the organization. And this topic of having a strategic mindset is particularly important for managing emergencies in general, and particularly in responding to the current COVID situation. So I'm excited to share this conversation with you.
Yeah, and I'm Don Hester. I work with Mays & Associates. I'm an IT auditor and cybersecurity consultant. My primary clients are local government, so I've been an auditor for local governments for over 20 years on the cybersecurity side of things. So I've seen a lot and talked to lots of different cities to see how they've dealt with some of this in the future. Just some housekeeping up front. Remember that if you have any questions during the live event, there's a place to put in questions and we will get to those. If you have questions after the live event, you can go to my blog and mine and Rob's blog at learnsecurity.org. You can click on that. I believe in the download section or the attachment section, you can see a link there. Also, there's a link to the slides. There's not many slides because this is mostly a talk. If you need CPE credit, you can track that. BrightTalk tracks that for you, but it's for self-reporting. So if you have any other questions afterwards, again, just check out our blog and get to it. So, gentlemen, the first thing I want to talk about, I know that we always have conversations offline. I talk to Rob quite often. I talk to you, Ron, quite often. We always talk about, finer aspects of managing an IT organization or dealing with cybersecurity. And one of the things that I know that we had talked about recently is that COVID-19, the pandemic, I think it has demonstrated to us the importance of technology during emergency situations and that it's available. And I think one of the key things that we took away from all of this is that organizations that had prepared for this by thinking strategically in the future about having a remote workforce were prepared for this, and that others struggled with it because they were more on the tactical side of things on a day-to-day basis, looking more of planning for, what's the current problem, how do I fix the current problem, and not thinking like, okay, what are my future potential problems and how do I address those future potential problems, or make decisions that put us in the best light for that. So good question to get back to you guys is like, how do we prepare for the unknown? Ron, you have any ideas on that?
Well, I wish I could say I had a crystal ball and everything was not unknown and we could just deal with it. Using the current COVID situation as an example, for the city of Fairfield, we did not expect it coming, like I think most people. And we took some steps early on to deal with just our regular day extender, people working from conferences or whatever. We took that approach that we already had in place, and I think that's the key, is that we had the foundations in place. And over the last 18 months or so, we've been beefing that up to handle capacity, as well as making it more secure than it had previously been, so that when the time came for us to, and we had literally 4 hours warning on this, to send 600 people home, and now they're working remotely. Not all of them, fortunately, because they didn't have that many spare pieces of equipment. But we were able to take what we had done to support the regular business needs and expand it and grow the capacity to support the people that were critical to work from home. There were some pieces we did not have in place, like how do we do full-blown video conferencing similar to what we're doing here? So we had to scramble. We put in Zoom, like a lot of organizations, and we're using that now to hold our public meetings. We've hardened it as much as Zoom allows us to do. We've made sure that all of our traffic resides only on servers located in the U.S. now. It's not able to go anywhere else. Things like that. And knock on the proverbial block of wood. So far, it's been safe. But I think the key is, it's true, you can't expect and can't plan, can't know everything in advance. But if you're dealing with the regular business needs that your organization has, most of the time you will have the foundations in place. And then you can simply grow and expand them. And because you already have them in place, because you've already taken the appropriate security measures, the capacity measures, you can grow them as quickly as you need to, or as quickly as possible, to set up yourself for the best chance of success. I think the organizations that struggled maybe were not quite prepared to have a complete change in their business model that this has required. Fortunately for a city location, I still have to have police officers on the street, firefighters still have to respond to emergency calls. So our basic business model hasn't necessarily changed, just where the staff that deliver those services are. But police and fire obviously still have to come into the facility and respond from there. So it hasn't been as disruptive for a local city organization as perhaps for a restaurant or an educational institution or some of those others.
Rob, your point of view?
Well, I can give it to you specifically from an academic standpoint, because as Ron was mentioning, a lot of businesses had to fundamentally change how they did their business. And academia is a really great example of this. Historically, students would show up to a building, you would go into a classroom, and there would be a teacher, and they would give either, if you're talking about K through 12 or higher ed, they would give their class on whatever topics there were for the day, right? So when the announcement came down from most of the governors and the government that said everybody needs to now do this from home, fundamentally that's a huge shift for academics, because up until this point, 99% of all academia operated in the traditional butts in seats, right? You would show up and there would be somebody who would teach you, your teacher, professor. And now the fundamental shift is all of that has to be done online, which a lot of people would assume, oh, well, that's just simply giving a presentation now through, technology bits like Zoom. But as an example, from a higher ed's perspective, there are certain things that happened that some students could not attend classes remotely, because when the announcement came that you had to go home, some of these students had to go back to their home countries, and some of those home countries do not allow encrypted traffic. So the platforms that they decided to use immediately encrypted all of the traffic. So now you have students in these locations that, they paid for their college education, but they can't attend class anymore. So they're trying to figure out at this point what to do with them, because some of that information, and here's where you get into this really weird line, and that is there's certain information that needs to be secured because of federal regulations, in this case like FERPA, in terms of, if you're recording a session for later playback, right? If somebody missed it, do you capture student names? Do you capture their faces? Things like that. So it was a huge shift from not only just a delivery standpoint of the content to the students, but also a consumption standpoint from the students, because a lot of students do have laptops, they do have a smartphone, but the bigger problem or the bigger issue they had is now their underlying internet connection. As Ron was mentioning, that infrastructure is now being taxed because, like IU, for example, we have about 130,000 students across 9 campuses, and they're all funneling back to a single VPN concentrator that did not have the capacity to handle that kind of, encryption, decryption load. So there had to be some immediate changes on how the delivery of that information was sent out to students. So there was a big steep learning curve for probably the first 2 weeks as everything was tested and, um, you know, settings were adjusted, emergency funding was approved to purchase additional equipment, things like that, or licensing in order to support it. And then they made some fundamental infrastructure design changes just to handle and split the staff separate from the faculty and students capabilities, right? So now staff could VPN in, they had their own concentrator, and faculty and students had their own. They were separate. They created separate networks for everybody, all within like a 2-week period. But the people who were actually doing all the work, they were working 16, 18-hour days straight to get this to work when all the students proverbially came back to school. So it was a very unique challenge.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of, did you ever teach that course, Rob? It's a Microsoft official curriculum. It was designing highly available web infrastructures.
Yep.
Yeah, so I taught that class once and I loved it. And one of the reasons why I loved it was not so much talking about how to set up web servers and huge arrays and all that kind of stuff, but the idea that you had to prepare for capacity. Making sure that you have the capacity for whatever is going. You don't know what the future is going to bring, so you have to make sure, whether you're doing clustering or load balancing or any of those types of things, making sure that you have capacity going forward. So I think that that's kind of an important aspect of this as well. And I think one of the challenges that I know that we had, our organization, was having thought, and I always had a problem with describing how I think strategically, because my network admin is always kind of asking me. He understands that he's very tactical, day to day. I need to fix this problem, and not necessarily thinking beyond fixing the problem. So what's the easiest way, fastest way to fix this? The easiest, fast way to fix it is not always what's best for the future, right? In fact, oftentimes it's not. It doesn't prepare you for the next issue that comes up. So he said, "You're very good at that, and can you kind of teach me a little bit of that?" And so I've had this struggle of trying to figure out, how do I explain to him how that works, or how I think. And I try to explain to him, it's like you're on a football field and you're on the 50-yard line and you're trying to make it to the goal, right? And of course, what the goal is for your organization, eventually my boss told me, he says, "I think everybody should be able to work from anywhere, on the beach, wherever it is. They should be able to do their work." So that in mind, we kind of already had a mindset going forward of like, what kind of technology, how should we use the technologies to get us in that direction? And so when the COVID got hit, we had already transitioned to Office 365. So we already had everything in place. We had already done initial training a couple of years ago when Teams first came out, but we didn't get very much adoption on it. In fact, I think we only had a few staff using it. And then when COVID hit, all of a sudden, everybody's asking, what should we be using? And my very astute technical admin said, "Hey, here's all the options. You can use Zoom, you can use this, you can use WebEx." You gave them all the options. And I and that wasn't strategic thinking, that was tactical thinking. It's like, here, all these things solve the problem. But the problem is, what solves the problem the best? And when I came back in, I said, no, we should be using Teams. We already pay for it. It's already there. Why are we spending more money for something else, right? It's something that some staff is already using. Everybody else just wasn't aware of it. So we transitioned to using it. We did online class for everybody, show them how to use it. Sometimes people still don't know that you can use it for all the features that it has. So there's still this adoption issue that we're dealing with, and we had to have a Teams meeting to show people how to use Teams, but we did get everybody through it. We recorded it. It's available for people afterwards, so they can go back and reference it. But I think having that strategic mindset, when I make a decision today, how is it going to move us forward in the future? One of the strategic decisions on why we're using Teams is the idea that our phone system is already beyond its life, right? So we either have to continue running it, paying higher expenses to keep it running. In other words, if there's a patch, we have to pay for it. It's no longer in the contract for it. If the hardware breaks, we have to buy new hardware. So we're kind of in a touchy situation with the phone system. And our idea was, we'll run it as long as we possibly can. And then our idea was we switch to Teams and then go to Microsoft's virtual phone system. Then I don't have to pay for hardware, so no large capital expense going forward. Just it's a part of what you're already paying for Office. There is a slightly more expensive license you have to get for that. But I also don't have to pay for phone lines anymore because it comes with what Microsoft has. So our strategic thinking what is going to put us in the best position in the future. Years ago, I was like, okay, Teams is what actually it wasn't called Teams, it's called Link way back then, and then it changed to Skype for Business. But way back then, we already knew that it could integrate into the phone system. We already kind of knew that that's the direction we wanted to go. And so 5 years ago, we were making decisions that helped prepare us for today. And I always look at it like this. I'm on that 50-yard line. I can move forward, or I can move backwards, or I can move parallel. But I want to kind of move in a direction that's going to get us the best possible place in the future. And also, we have to look at budget and all those other things as well. So I hope that, again, trying to explain how my thought process works doesn't always translate very well, but that's the best way I could do it. I don't know. You guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you said it really well. First, you have to understand what the objective is, what's the long-term goal. And as for your organization, it was, we need anybody to work from anywhere. That's great. Now that we know what that goal is, we can take those incremental tactical steps like you've been doing in the last few years, putting in place the systems, the infrastructure. Yeah, maybe it's not to the same scale, but at least the foundations are there and you can move it forward. In the case of city government, I have to prepare for all sorts of weird emergencies that most organizations assume government's going to take care of. So that, I think, helps my team, and it is a team effort, in having that mindset of when everything hits the fan and we still have to keep services running, how do we do that? Again, we don't know what's going to happen at any given moment in time, but we have put the thought into the objective is to keep the city operating when everything else is not functioning. How do we do that? What do we have to put in place today so that when it happens next week, next month, next year, we have the foundations and we can make that happen. It does take, and I don't know what else to call it, but some sort of strategic mindset around keeping that end goal, the touchdown, to use your analogy, Don. The objective is to cross the goal line. How do we get there? Do we go straight? Do we do the loop around the left or the right end, or however that works? But as long as we're making continuous progress towards that goal, no matter how small or how large, we're setting ourselves up for better outcomes than if we just simply wait for something to happen.
I kind of look at it also like it's risk management, right? I kind of look at everything kind of like in probability and statistics. Like what types of activities am I going to do that is going to increase the likelihood that in the future IT is going to continue to bring value to the organization. We're going to be able to continue to mitigate risks, right? So if I do anything, what am I setting myself up for? And what is going to put me in the best position for that? And I guess that's a part of having like a governance mindset as well as a strategic mindset. And that is what part of my goals, part of the parameters of me getting to there. In other words, I don't want to go out of bounds. Part of my requirements to get there is to make sure that IT continues to bring value to the organization and that I continue to mitigate risks. I'm afraid that a lot of local governments here have been rushing around to try and implement something for remote workforce, but the process of mitigating risks has been kind of sidelined. It's like, we need to set this up right now. It's an emergency situation. We need people to be working, but nobody's like, okay, now that everybody's connecting via VPN, now they're connecting with their own devices. What have we done to secure those and mitigate the risk going forward? And I think that that's another challenge that we have if we haven't set ourselves up to think about these things going to the future. And that is, how do we do it in a way that is going to set us up for bring us success, in other words, IT bringing value to the organization, and mitigate risks at the same time. And I think, Ron, you had talked about, you were in charge of IT and security, and that's I think is a hard row to hoe, so to speak, that you have to have both mindsets and you have to balance them. Typically in larger organizations, those two roles are separate because they're oftentimes at odds with each other. I know that I have a challenge with that because, you know, I have a tendency to probably be a little bit more on the secure side. I'm a little bit more risk adverse. So sometimes I'm more concerned about making sure that we are mitigating risk than actually bringing the value. But I think I do an okay job. But what do you think of that?
It is a challenge. I think we are a relatively small organization. So, you know, I'm not, you know, an Apple computer with, you know, 500,000 employees across the world. I'm in one city. So I don't have the luxury of having a completely dedicated security team. In the case of a smaller organization like ours, I think it's actually helpful because me being the way I'm put together, a lot like you, Don, I do look at the risks of doing step A versus step B. And it comes down to me, I've still got to get to that finish line, and I have to keep the business operating, I have to keep the city government operating. So as long as I can do that and mitigate the highest probability risk, not necessarily every risk, some risk you just have to live with because, you know, the proverbial saying of, you know, the only system that's secure is one nobody can use. Well, then what's the point of having the system? So you have to kind of balance that out. So when COVID hit and we had to rapidly mobilize the workforce, we had already put in place, you know, we're not going to let personal systems be used for connecting to the city right now, just because we don't have the ability to secure their endpoints anymore because they're personal. So we had machines available for people to take home. We did have to buy a few more, but we had enough to get through the crunch, so that people who are now working remotely are still using a city system that the regular technical support staff can access remotely, can deal with, has the endpoint protection. It's using the encrypted VPN tunnels coming back in, you know, through the firewalls, the next gen firewalls. So we still have complete control of the complete chain of communication that the people are using. The big liability now is more on the human side of, you know, now I'm sitting at my kitchen table and my kids are running around and my significant other is looking over my shoulder. Are they potentially seeing information they shouldn't see? Well, part of our you know, telecommuting agreement, you know, advises folks that they need to take steps to make sure that information's not accessed by people who really shouldn't see it. Granted, most of what we do is not, you know, national security kinds of stuff, but there's still some stuff that really shouldn't be seen beyond the people it's intended for. So by doing that, we had all of that foundation in place so we could rapidly scale it out. Other cities that I'm aware of through MESAC, Metropolitan Information Systems Association of California, big name, some of them are using things like the Windows Terminal Server, the Citrix servers, things like that, so that even though they may be using, an employee's personal device, all the processing and all the information is still happening on agency-owned equipment. So it's doing the best they can. But I think you're right in that many organizations, doesn't matter which organization you're talking about, we're simply we got to get something in place. Let's do it. If it works, good. We'll come back and secure it later.
Well, you brought up a point also that I thought was kind of important. You have a policy for telework, right? And I know a lot of organizations that as being the auditors or helping them out with other types of things, a lot of them said there's no work from home, which then put them, I think, in a bad position. I kind of think that there's a big, huge benefit that some people kind of may have missed in the ability for having people work from home. And one of them was, and you can see that people are starting to kind of catch on for it. Housing a bunch of people in a building costs money, right? There's the real estate expense. There's the expense of the power, the electricity. There's the expense of the time that an employee is on the road, driving, commuting back and forth. In addition to that, increases more pollutants in the air because more people are driving every day. It causes more stress because people are in, traffic. I know people that drive from Tracy to San Francisco every day, and they take 2.5 hours to get in the morning and 2.5 hours to get home at night. That's 5 hours that they're away from their family. That can't necessarily be good for a long period of time. So I think that once you're starting to see, and you have some companies that are saying, hey, this works, let's just maybe make some of this permanent. I think that's kind of those organizations kind of being more in the foresight, and the other ones that were just like, oh, we're never going to allow anybody to work remote. And now they're stuck with, they have to let people work remote, those that can. So again, having that mindset that this is the way things are kind of going in the direction. The idea that you can have everything in the cloud means that where you are is irrelevant, right? And there's some efficiencies with that. I was talking to one of our partners about the efficiencies on audits. I mean, if we have an audit and we have 5 people and we send them out to a city and they're all working on that audit, if one of them finishes their section first and there's nothing else for them to do, what are they going to do? Well, if they're a remote workforce, they can actually switch and go to another audit and help out where they need help. That makes us much more efficient. If they were on site at one city in the South Bay, and then and you say, hey, we want you to go to the North Bay to another city to do an audit, that's going to take half a day. So it's a waste of time. If they're online, they can just switch and they're in the other audit and they're up and running. So there's all kinds of efficiencies. I think sometimes on the business side of things, they're not necessarily looking at. I understand for a city, they're not looking at, that type of ability, but I think other organizations can look at those types of abilities. Anything on the academic side, Rob?
Well, we ran into those same scenarios, right? Like one of our biggest areas of concerns, like you mentioned earlier, is our university having 9 campuses throughout the state. We have a lot of what we call student technology labs. Those are areas that have systems that have predefined applications installed for, various programs, right, and their support. So one of the biggest items that we had facing the students was how do they get their schoolwork done when they don't have access to these physical labs anymore. So we had already put in place, it's branded as IU Anywhere. That's the branding name for it. And it's basically the concept of being able to access applications from anywhere in the world as long as you had internet access. So we used Citrix, and this was a program that started about 8 years ago. So we already had virtualized applications to help support some of the student base, but not, all 100 and some odd thousand. So one of the things that they did is they took one of the basic deployments for the operating system with other applications, and they turn that into a virtual desktop infrastructure. And we now have a web-based Citrix receiver that basically any student anywhere in the world on any device, they can now remote in, they can authenticate with their IU credentials, they'll gain access to a student technology lab build, and then they can do all their schoolwork. So it was a way for us to extend that functionality to support students because, everybody's pretty much got a laptop these days, right? Or some sort of computing environment, right? Whether it's Mac or Dell or Windows or whatever. The problem is they don't have a lot of the high-end applications, or they don't have hardware that can run these high-end applications. So the university went through this process trying to already see what this was going to happen as part of that strategic view. And it just happened that that was probably the easiest out of all of the significant changes that happened. That was the easiest because they just simply took what was there, deployed it into the Citrix farm, made it available, and there's all the applications that all the students and faculty needed. So from that perspective, that was a very short window because as kind of like a key highlight already here, they had already been thinking about it that from a strategic standpoint, right? Whereas there's a lot of other organizations and academic institutions out there that weren't heading down that path, and now it's, oh man, it's how do we get this to our students, right? How do our students run this application that requires either a supercomputer or a mainframe at the back end? Like as an example, the university just this year is getting ready to turn on their new Big Red 200, and that's our latest supercomputer that's out there. And a lot of computer science students have to run, high-end calculations on this supercomputer, right? Not only that, but a lot of our research, including COVID research, is done on that. And a lot of it has to be done remotely. It's a connection from our campus network, and the only way to get to it is you have to run it from one of these student technology labs. And so now having that availability from a virtual standpoint, all of our researchers and students, they can run these queries against that particular system without any hindrance to research. So those are a couple of things from seeing how, from a strategic standpoint, how that has benefited in this particular scenario with, COVID, for example, and how we're at day 60 or so, something like that, 66 maybe, at this work from home process. So that's kind of what the university has done. I do know other, like K through 12, for example, our local school here, they started moving to Chromebooks several years ago, and this year they're going to move to iPads. So the Chromebooks have gone through a 7-year life cycle, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they've kind of hit their end of end of life, and to be quite honest, there's several of them have missing keys. You're talking about giving them through to kids from, I think they started at grade 6, they issued them, right? And whatever system that student was issued in grade 6, they kept that same system all the way to graduation.
Oh, wow.
Right.
That's cool.
So they would turn it in at the end of the school year, and then come in August when the school would start back up, they would go in and they would be reassigned the exact same system they had before. So if they lost a key, on their keyboard, it was lost until they were done using it. So now that the hardware platform itself has kind of come to its end. So now they're going to switch everything over to iPads. And part of that is there's, again, from a strategic standpoint, there's easier things that they can do from a management standpoint to those devices than they could with Chromebooks, even though those Chromebooks were still reporting back into the school infrastructure in order to gain access to certain tools that they needed, but they decided to move to Apple and iPads. So it'll be kind of interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be really kind of interesting to see how that turns out. Just going from a laptop to a tablet, even if the tablet has a keyboard, that's kind of a. I know that, like you talk about Citrix and stuff like that, that ability that somebody has to remotely connect in so that it does not matter what end device you have, what your endpoint is. And we've talked about this before, I think, Rob, you and I at least have, is that in the future, it's not going to matter what system you're running because everything's going to be up in the cloud, remote, and you just connect to it and do whatever you need to do where the horsepower is. So I've run remote desktop off my, in an emergency situation, off of my phone. It's a little difficult, but I was able to get what I needed done. But yeah.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
I think Rob mentioned something really, really important there, is that for that student lab environment, sounded like at least a year or more prior to the COVID event, the strategic objective of the organization was to make it available anywhere a student needed to access it. And by doing that, once COVID hit, then he was able to just scale it out and continue down that path. And I think that gets back to, what is the objective of the organization? Do we want to, and now that we have to, have our workforce access anything they need to do their job from any place in the world at any time? If that's the objective, that sets you up to do a lot of things that you couldn't do if that was not your objective. And I think tying what we're doing on the technology side into those long-range objectives of the organization is so critical, in that it gives us the ability to have the flexibility when unforeseen things happen. We can make the moves we need to make in order to keep the organization operational.
And I think that's a good point. And I think one of the challenges to that, and that's what this next slide is talking about, the rapid change rate and the dynamic nature of technology, right? So one of the things I always talk about when doing consulting or anything else, or even when I'm trying to figure out what we should be doing towards the future, is that all of my plans have to be tentative. In other words, so I look at, I can have a 10-year strategic plan, but I think Bon Jovi once said this, his plans for the future he writes in pencil in case he has to erase them, right?
Yep.
That's just this little quote, and I liked it because it's like, you have to hold it kind of tentative, because 10 years ago, where I thought we would be today is not where we were. It wasn't even what everybody was talking about where we would be 10 years ago. So today things change, and it changes so fast that, and this is hard. The hard part for being in cybersecurity is we're trying to rapidly mitigate new risks that just pop up every day, new vulnerabilities, new attack methods, whatever it is. It's constantly changing, and then we have to deal with this technology landscape that is constantly moving. I feel like you're almost in a storm on the sea. You know what I mean? It's like the perfect storm where it's everything's just constantly in flux. New technologies are being bought and developed for in a city situation. I think you probably see this a lot more. They're doing all kinds of new and innovative things for Parks and Rec, or for the golf course, or whatever all the other components this city has that are not the normal business type of components. And it's just that dynamic and fast pace that kind of makes this, on top of it, a little more challenging, I think, than you would have in any other type of situation. Planning for the future financially is probably a little bit easier than it is, and thinking strategically is probably a little bit better than technology trying to do it. In other words, it's going to be more difficult on the technology side, I think.
That's true, and that's why whenever I'm working on the proverbial IT strategic plan, I always try to keep it focused on the business objectives as opposed to the specific technologies, because as you mentioned, Don, they're just changing moment to moment. So by having that focus on the business as it wants to accomplish these 3 or 2 key things over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, keeping my IT strategic plan focused on that, now I've got the goal line, and I can begin to build the places with what's available and what's what's supportable and sustainable right now versus what's, bleeding edge way out there. But I can keep those implementations in line with where the organization wants to go 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And that gives me the flexibility to, dodge right, dodge left as things come up.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of, I've seen it a number of times. I also teach part-time, and a couple of schools that I've worked for, I've taught online forever. So for me, I've been doing it, for 15 years. So for me, when this COVID thing came out, I teach one class online. There was no change for me.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing was different because I was already online. We had a number of instructors that really struggled with it because some of them had never taken any training on doing online classes because they never wanted to do it. They were very old school. I need to do it in the classroom. I don't trust the internet, whatever. People have different opinions on stuff like this. And now there was a much harder and much more Herculean task for them to switch all of their courses to online courses. All of my courses, even when I taught in class, I used remote labs. So if you switch those classes, having had that mindset that it's better to have it remotely set up so it's easier for students, they can work from home, they don't have to be in the classroom, they can work outside the classroom. There was a lot of reasons why we talked about, well, let's have remote labs so that they can do it outside the classroom. Yes, we have class time for that, but this would be good for that. But it also made it good so that when we had to do this and we had to switch to being online, it was still available. For some of our courses, we had a harder time, I think, with it, like the A+ class. In the A+ class, the instructor teaches it, you have to build a computer, right? And so we had a bunch of spare parts, and we have a lab in at the college where you could actually put together a computer. That's a hard class to teach online. Showing somebody how to properly set RAM into the position, you know what I mean? All that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That tactile experience, doing a little lab where you drag it and drop it onto a place is not the same thing as making sure it gets set in there properly, right? I don't know how many times students would say, oh, this isn't working, and I'm like, make sure you check the RAM, because they never seed it right? Anyways, but so I think that, yeah, thinking about those things towards the future, I think had set up, well, I was set for it. The other instructors, I think, had a harder time with it because, they're like, I'm doing a history class. There's no way to do it online. Well, I don't know that there's no way to do it online. History is actually kind of an easier one to do online. Welding, now that's a harder one to do online. I'll grant you that one on that one because that's very tactile. You have to be on site, that type of thing. Or the automotive lab, right? But I still think there's ways that they can social distance with that, and that is having had all the book learning and all the videos that you need to watch about how to change a fuel injector, that students do all of that, and then you set up a class where students don't come all at one same time. They come at different times. They schedule it so that you can have social distancing. So again, not a huge requirement if you already had some of the other stuff available that could be done remote. So technology can help out in that aspect too. Ron, you had said earlier in your quote, you said you plan strategically, but then you act tactically. So what do you mean by that?
It's kind of what I was mentioning just a couple minutes ago, where I like to know what the organization's long-term strategic objectives are. And that's usually set, in my case, by city council or by city management and the executive leadership team. So once we know what that is, that establishes the goal line. I can use your example again. So now that I know what that is, I know that over the next, pick a number, 5 years, we want to be able to do these 3 or 4 things that we can't do right now in terms of delivering service to the organization. Let's just pick one. We want to enable online reservation of golf carts, just to pick a simple example. Okay, so that means I now have to have an inventory of golf carts. I have to be able to have a reservation system. I have to be able to let anybody access it anywhere from any device I have no control over. So that tells me and begins to set in motion all the steps I need to take tactically to deliver on that 5-year strategic objective. So by having the business objective, and again, for me, it's more important to know what the business wants to do than the technology. Technology is going to change, and it's going to change 10 times by the time I get there. But if I know what the desired business outcome is, what is the thing I need to deliver to the residents of the city, now I can begin to put in place in a planned, intentional manner, so I can take into account that whole risk profile of, human risk, cyber risk, technology failure risk, all those kinds of risks. But I can do that in a planned, intentional way, so that over the time horizon we get there, it's there, it's ready to go, and we know that it is reasonably stable, reasonably secure. Again, you're not going to mitigate every single risk, but you've gotten to the point where you can deliver the service. Now, if the unexpected happens and I have to suddenly shorten that time frame from 5 years to 4 hours, at least I have the foundation in place to where I can scale out much more quickly. It may not be 100% of what everybody was hoping for, but at least we've gotten the basic functionality, the must-have functionalities there, and we've done it in a way that's not introduced unnecessary risk.
And I think you brought up a really good point, and I think Rob also talked to this, and that is having that foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is figuring out what that foundation needs to be, right? But I hadn't always thought of it that way, but I like the way you talk about that. You have to have a foundation that you can launch off of and do the, in the Marine Corps, we used to call it adapt and overcome, right? But you have to be in a good position to be able to adapt and overcome. The better position you're at, the more likely you are to be successful. So I think that foundation is a good way to look at it. I like that. Rob, you have anything to add?
No, I think you're spot on with that, right? Like, from looking at strategic plans, that's the long-term goals, and having those plans in place, it's easier in a situation we're in now. Like Ron was saying, is instead of going from a 5-year window, you might have to go to a few hour window, right? But you already have things in place, and like he said, they may not be 100%. They may not be what everybody's going to ask for or what everybody's expecting, but the end result is you have something in place that in a short order you can take that strategic view or that strategic plan and shift it into that tactical deployment phase and get things ready for your employees so that they can continue to function, right? That they continue to work.
That was part of what our contingency plan for our phone system, if it goes out, because phone systems are not inexpensive. They're actually kind of expensive. They're very, the hardware is very specialized. There's a lot of moving parts to it because you want to have unified communications. There's a lot of connections you have to work out. So one of the things we kind of looked at is we already have Office 365. We already have Teams. This has the ability for us to switch over in a moment's notice. In fact, I've already been practicing on another Office 365 tenant, setting up the voice connections for it so that we know if there is a disaster with that system that we're able to transition. Now, we don't think that it's not imminent. We don't think it's imminent at all. The hardware's not that old. We have the latest updates on it. It runs we've never had an issue with it. So we do have a contingency plan. So we do have that foundation, and we can switch very quickly if necessary. And I think that's part of what you have to consider in the business continuity side of things is like, how do I keep the business running, right? Because if the auditors aren't auditing and the tax people aren't doing tax and the accounting services can't do their job, then I'm not going to get paid. So you can think of it as being a little bit of survivalist, but the business has to run, right? And whatever those business processes, like Ron was talking about, we have to make sure they're going to work. And saying no to everything, it doesn't always work. So we have to make sure that we can adapt, overcome, be ready for, have a good foundation going forward. And I think that kind of covers it. You guys have any last comments or anything last to add on?
I'll just throw in that, as trite as it is, the key is to always prepare and expect the unexpected. I don't know how you expect something that you don't expect, but making sure that what we're doing from a technology standpoint, as you mentioned, Don, and I think Rob, you've also mentioned this, we only do technology because the business needs it to deliver its services, whatever its services is. If it's accounting and tax and audit, if it's education, if it's government services, whatever the business is, it needs technology to deliver that service to its ultimate end consumer. That's the only reason we're doing the technology. And we need to do everything in our power to make sure that we tie every technology project, every technology expenditure into forwarding the mission of the organization. And by tying it to the long-term objectives of the organization, it sets that sort of foundation. I don't know what else to call it. Here's the things that over time I know I have to get to. How do I intentionally plan for and deliver that and mitigate the risk as much as reasonable? And again, you're never going to get everything done, but try and keep it reasonable.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. You don't have unlimited budget. You don't have unlimited snap or resources. So you have to kind of work with what you got. And that's part of it. And I think part of what I think about things like Microsoft Teams works with Office 365. We're already paying for Office 365. So there's an economic advantage or a financial advantage there in that we're bundling services to get them cheaper. So that's a part of also my thought process behind it. So I have a lot of different areas that I'm looking at, right? I'm not just looking at, okay, we need a web platform in the future. No, I was thinking we need to be able to work remotely. We need to have a potential replacement for a phone system. We need to have the ability to do conference calling or webcam conferences. So I was looking at multiple things, and I was also trying to figure out how are we going to do that in a cost-effective manner. And this one solution popped out as being kind of like the best one. So when we get to this point where it's like, oh, we need to do some video conferencing, why not use this? We already have it. It's already in place. We already have, and in the future, now that we've made that decision, if something happens to the phone system, we're not saying, okay, everybody stop using this other product. We all need to jump over to Teams because we're doing this other phone system, or being stuck in saying, oh, we have to buy a different phone system, right? So I know that sounds like there's a lot of gears, and there is. There's a lot of different things and facets you kind of have to look at. So that's my one thing. I do have one question. What are your personal opinions on the best platforms to use for remote collaboration? Rob, you want to throw that out? You want to have an answer to that? And then we'll go to Ron.
The best platforms for remote collaboration. Wow, that's a tough one because there's so many different. As an example, at IU, we're using so many different platforms to do certain things. We use everything from Slack to Teams to Skype to Zoom. I mean, we're using Canvas. We're using Blackboard from a student's perspective. A lot of it is going to be dependent upon what the end goal is. As an example, we use Blackboard from the student side because it allows for collaboration between the students and the faculty. They can set up quizzes. They can do, as an example, Don, you've used this in the past where, you post information or a question, and it's to help keep track of student engagement, right? So students have to answer, whatever the question was by a certain date and time in order for them to be present in the class. And that is something that we had to make some major adjustments from a collaboration standpoint, because this goes back to federal regulations regarding accreditation of higher academic institutions, right? So we have to provide the accrediting bodies. Look, here's all of the logs. Here's what students are doing. Here's how we're tracking their online work. Because one of the biggest fears that we have from an academic standpoint is the loss of accreditation, because the minute we switched from delivering everything from a traditional standpoint and moved everything into a virtual platform, um, technically, the way that the rules were written, way back in the 80s, that's classified as a correspondence,
Yeah.
not a class, right? So there's certain things that you have to do from an academic standpoint, and collaboration is a big one, is the collaboration between the professor and the students, and we have to keep track of that. So we use Blackboard, for example, as part of that environment. Between the faculty and staff, we use anything from, like I said, Slack to Teams. We're starting to move into Teams as a full deployment across the entire organization, and part of that is um, from a faculty staff perspective. We used to have Exchange on premise. That product is being retired by Microsoft in a few years. So there's certain departments that have already moved to Exchange Online. And again, this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Don, is we now have, you know, Office 365, and now we have Teams. So we're now taking advantage of those tool sets from an organization standpoint as our collaborative platform. So like you, we're going through the whole Teams environment now to figure out what we can tie into it, how it's going to be tied in, how our students can interact with it moving forward. So that's our kind of a long-term summer project before the students return in the fall.
Well,
So
that's
those
cool.
are those are kind of the platforms we use from a collaborative standpoint.
Yeah. And you have the special need of having a learning management system that, schools use. I know our campus uses Canvas for that because, again, it's for those special needs. So I would say, Ron, do you have anything to add to that?
Just a little bit, and forgive me for taking a quote from a commercial, but I think the best platform for remote collaboration is the one that most people will use, whichever one you have available to you. And that varies depending on what part of the world you're in, what environment you work in. As Robert was mentioning, in the educational system, things like Canvas and Blackboard are very important for their process. But the most important thing is to have a system that will allow the collaboration you need, whatever that might be, and that your folks will use, that your people will use, and not fight you on adopting. So for example, even though right now my organization has Teams and we are using Teams and we've made it available organization-wide, for a lot of our remote meetings and things like that, we're using Zoom for two simple reasons. One is most everybody knows how to use Zoom before we even rolled it out. It's fairly straightforward. It's fairly easy to use. The second one is it was the fastest way for me to be able to provide plain old telephone participation as well as the online webcam audio like we're using here. Can Teams do that? Sure, but I would have had to, as you mentioned, Don, buy a whole new license, do the telephone system integration. I couldn't do that in 4 hours. I could go online, register for Zoom, and get it rolled out within 4 hours. So I think the best platform is one that meets your needs and that your team will use, whatever that might be.
Yeah, and I would say I like to be as agnostic as possible. Yes, we did use the Microsoft platform because we went to Office 365, and our main reason in the original move in that direction was I didn't want to be an Exchange administrator anymore. We didn't necessarily have the skill set in-house to continue to run a server like that. Every different iteration of Exchange, it used to be one box was Exchange, and then they broke out all the roles, and you could have up to 7 different servers for Exchange, and I was like, this is ridiculous. And trying to keep up with all of that and trying to keep up with cybersecurity, I'm like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. It's a whole other skill set you have to have, and you have to keep up to date with it. So we kind of moved towards Office 365, and there was other reasons too. Just our office was always 2 years behind the curve, which was causing security issues. So there was multiple reasons why Office 365 was best for us at the time, and it continues to be that way. I would say whatever solution you find that's going to work for collaboration, whether it be Teams or SharePoint or whatever it is, you have to have some training for end users to get them to adopt it. And you have their risk in any project. The end users will reject it, or they won't use it, or it won't be as efficient as it could be, or they will misuse it, and it will increase other risks. So in order to mitigate all of that, I think there's a number of things that you have to kind of have in place up front, and that is a training program to show everybody how the product works. Because like Ron said, Zoom is really easy to get into. May not be the most secure one in the world unless you go through some other hoops to make sure that it is more secure. And they've done a good job in getting it up there. Teams takes a little bit more of getting used to. Because it does more than just a video conferencing. It does have the video conferencing. It does have the phone service built in, but it's also a place to store documents and share documents and work on documents at the same time. And there's a lot of advanced features into it and there's a lot of flexibility to it. Sometimes when there's a lot of flexibility, end users just throw their hands up and say, I don't know what to do with this. So hopefully if you can get the end user buy-in is going to be important, like Ron said, in order to get them. And in order to get that, you have to do a lot of training. And one person can complain about it and everybody else starts complaining about it. And it could be the most perfect solution in the world and it will fail because negative talk that employees have about it. So you have to make sure that you have that positive aspect on what that's going to be, that you train them on it and show them how it's going to help them do their job, how it's going to help them mitigate risk. Not that a lot of end users are interested necessarily in that, but you want to make sure that they use it securely as well. So again, for us, it's just we're actually using Teams. Actually, it kind of went out of. I thought we were going to introduce Teams and people would use it for the video conferencing and maybe this. No, they're setting it up for the audits. They're using it to connect into the remote client because they can put a web page in there. So they actually took off with it, and we had a couple of employees who were already kind of using it, and so they kind of ran with it, and that was a good thing for us and then we did the training, and so we still have employees that'll say, I need to do a video conference and do a recording for training, and I'm like, we already have it. Let's just use this. Oh, I was going to use this other product. I'm like, huh? Well, if we want to do training, again, we already have Teams. We can do the training. We can record the meeting, and it'll automatically take it and stick it on Office 365 and another product called Stream, which is like your own internal YouTube channel. So it manages all the videos for you, does transcripts on them. It does all kinds of really cool stuff. So my thought was, why use a different tool to do a recording for training when we already have this? Again, maximizing kind of what we have, and part of that is making sure those end users understand all the features and they can adopt it. So that was a good question. What's the best platforms out there? But for learning management, I use Canvas. I kind of really like it. I've used other ones. I've used WebCT, which is now gone and now part of Blackboard. And I've used Blackboard. And Blackboard, you can do a lot of stuff. It's really powerful, but it gets to the point where it gets almost too complicated to, really you have to get specialists to kind of do stuff with it. It's kind of like Salesforce.
Yep. The only other thing I would add to all of this, no matter what tool you ultimately select, it should be something that is relatively easy for your constituents to use. That's gonna provide the largest adoption rate. Because as you were mentioning, Don, if it's too complicated, they're going to start to complain, and then they're not going to use it. They're going to go find something that's easier to set up, right?
Yep.
So that's the only other thing I would add from a collaborative standpoint.
Great point.
What happened to my... Oh, there it is. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Ron for joining the session today, giving up some of your time to kind of help everybody else. I want to thank Rob as well on your day off to join us. The idea of going, again, with my sessions that I have is we're trying to make the world cyber safe, and part of that is having some of these IT soft skills that everybody's asking for. So that's why we did this session today on strategic thinking, because we thought that was kind of one of those important ones. Again, this webinar is good for continuing education for self-recording. If you're CISSP, CISA, or any of those other organizations that have any of those requirements. One of the things that we've been talking about lately, and that is that restaurants have been disproportionately hit with, and so have hotels and stuff too, but have been hit with the COVID-19 outbreak. So there's a restaurant relief fund. It's a nonprofit, and you can make donations there. Again, a lot of companies are trying to raise awareness about this so that we can kind of help, and together we can get through this. So we want to kind of throw that one out there. There are other ones, if you don't want to donate to that, there's other things out there too, like the World Health Organization has some projects as well, if you're interested in that. And again, Mays & Associates has a variety of cybersecurity resources and services. You can check those out at maysassociates.com/cybersecurity. Please rate us and follow us on our channel. You can look for upcoming talks. I think we have a MESAC talk coming up in a few weeks on talking to executive management. So that looks like it's going to be a really good session. So I don't have anything else. You guys have anything else? Otherwise, we will end the presentation.
Nope.
Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. You guys have a good weekend.